Christian apologists love to explain away the genocide of the Canaanites by the Hebrews in the Old Testament by saying that God was actually saving lives because the Canaanites practiced child sacrifice. Therefore, by ordering the Jews to kill every man, woman, and child, he was actually saving lives. But God, ever the hypocrite, accepts a child sacrifice of his own in the book of Judges. Hi, if you've never seen this face before, I'm Laurentia. I was in the church for over 50 years, mostly as an evangelical Christian. That's how I was born and raised. You haven't seen my face in a while if you're one of my older fans, because after the election, I made a couple videos, but they didn't do very well. I think because they weren't talking about Trump. Everyone was so obsessed with Trump that if you didn't want to talk about Trump and politics, I wasn't getting any views anymore. And I am going to say this, that I'm not an expert. I have my own views. I have my own thoughts, of course, like everyone else, but who am I? I'm just a very average intelligence person. I'm not an expert in foreign trade or politics or anything. So I just prefer not to talk about it myself. If you guys want to talk about it in the comments, that's fine. I did do only one video on Trump, and I think that was before the election. I'll link it here. And that was just trying to find out if he really is a Christian or not. And my own research kind of surprised me on that. So that might be one you might be interested in if you're still obsessed with Trump. Otherwise, as far as him as a politician or anything else, I'm not interested in that. So that's where we stand. So I hope this video does better. So without any further ado, I want to talk today about the things in the Bible that I didn't know were in there when I was a Christian. And the reason I didn't know is because no pastor that I ever had, and I was in the church for over 50 years and probably attended at least 10 different churches. And not one single pastor talked about any of these things. And if they did, it was completely glossed over and not explained and tried to keep it on the down low. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll get to the story of the child sacrifice. It's in Judges here in a minute. But first of all, let's just start in Genesis. Let's start in the very beginning. We don't have to read very long in the Bible before God's mistakes, or we could say the writers of the Bible's mistakes, who are supposedly they're supposedly inspired by God, before these crop up. And the first one that I want to talk about is in Genesis 3. And I'm going to read the verse to you, and it'll be up on a graphic. And it says, this is in Genesis 3:1. The snake was the most intelligent of the wild animals the Lord have made. The complete Jewish Bible says crafty. Other versions say cunning, just making the snake seem as if this was an animal that God created that was smart and cunning and crafty. And we know, modern biologists know, that that isn't true at all. The snake is nowhere near the most intelligent animal. They're not particularly cunning. They run on instinct. Other mammals, which the snake is a reptile, and reptiles don't have a prefrontal cortex. They can't have logic and reasoning like most humans or other mammals do. The prefrontal cortex is involved in a lot of complex behaviors and thought processes, including decision making, evaluating choices and selecting appropriate actions, planning, problem solving, working memory, social behavior, and personality. In fact, a prefrontal cortex is what makes a person or an animal be able to make any kind of rational decisions. And even if the snake were smarter than we think it is, they're still not even the smartest reptile. They're not. They are in the middle somewhere. So there are other reptiles that are even smarter than they are. And most of those are like monitor lizards. They're actually a little higher on the brain scale, but even they're nowhere near the smartest animals. The smartest animals, according to biologists, we have of course, apes and monkeys and dolphins and dogs and cats and all kinds of different, raccoons, octopuses, pigs, crows, gray parrots, and other things. So, how do the Christians explain that? How do they explain this? Well, they say that the snake was actually Satan. As a Christian, I always thought that the snake was Satan. And I guess I thought that the Bible, and probably in Genesis, said the snake was Satan. And that's how he was so crafty and cunning. Now, that still doesn't explain other snakes. Like, was this the only snake in the whole world or something? It's funny how it didn't even dawn on me. So stupid. But anyway, so Satan, that's how it's always explained away. But let's be honest, nowhere in the Bible does it say that. Now, there are a couple of vague verses in Revelation, which was written 1,500 years after Genesis, and they weren't written by the same people, and they were written hundreds, more than 1,000 years apart. And it just says that in Revelation, it talks about the snake of old. Never says the snake in the Garden of Eden. So Christians will latch onto that. See, the snake of old. But the snake, that's just a saying. Calling someone a snake is more meaning that they're bad, right? That they're yucky. It doesn't have anything to do with thinking that they're just smart as heck, right? So that doesn't even add up. Now, let's talk about another excuse that Christians make. And they will say, well, the snakes probably were really smart. They probably were the smartest animal, and then God dumbed them down. So the problem with this is that nowhere does it say that God dumbed the snake down. It just says the snake will now crawl on its belly forever and ever. That's its curse, which makes you wonder, if the snake is Satan, why would he curse every single snake and make it crawl on its belly? But in any event, God did not say, you're going to crawl on your belly and I'm going to dumb you down. And if he did make the snake dumb in comparison to what he was, Jesus didn't know that, because in Matthew, Jesus tells his followers to be wise as snakes. So apparently, Jesus, who is God, doesn't know that snakes aren't really very wise. So it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? But again, as a Christian, you gloss over these things, you don't think about them. But anyway, if you're a Christian and you have a better excuse as to what the situation is with the snake in Genesis 3, let me know. Okay, let's stay with Satan, because he's such an interesting character and there's so many lies and so many twists told by pastors and Christians about Satan. And the next one is in the book of Job. Now, how many of you ex-Christians were always told that Satan, the guy with the horns, the devil, him and God made a bet about this guy named Job, who was rich and loved God and all of that. The story itself is like so problematic. I can't even believe it, but I didn't see that. But we're not going to go into any of that. We're going to just talk about this Satan character. Every single pastor that I ever had led me to believe, either by saying it or by omission, that Satan in the book of Job was, again, Satan. But that's not true. That's a lie. And I was absolutely blown away by that. In the original Hebrew, the word is the Satan. The Satan, not capital, not the noun. This is a verb. Satan means adversary or counselor or lawyer or someone who is challenging you. And so this person or this being was actually an employee of God, much like a lawyer or someone he would had to challenge him. It was not Satan. Have you ever wondered, why would Satan, the one who was thrown out of heaven with his followers, what would he be doing anyway up in heaven? And then telling God, oh, I was just wandering around the earth. How are you doing, buddy? It doesn't even make any sense. So this Satan, this adversary of God or this counselor of God, He's the one under God's orders to say to do all the horrible things to Job that happened. This isn't the little devil running around. Doesn't that make the story even like 1,000 times worse? That it was one of God's employees doing this? If you don't believe me, do your own research on this because it's absolutely true and it's just appalling. And I'm disgusted that a pastor who went through seminary, who studies the Bible, they have to know this. They have to know that. And they lied. They're lying to you. So if you're still a Christian and you're in the church, go ask your pastor about this. Please do. And then get back to me and let me know what they say to you because I'm really curious. All right, let's get Satan out of here. Get behind me, Satan. And let's go to Numbers 31, where we see that the Israelites are at war with the Midianites. And they have slaughtered every single man, woman, child, baby, except for the virgins. And they're told to take the virgins back with them and, marry them or make them sex slaves or whatever they did with them. And we're all supposed to be happy, happy, and whatever. And, of course, this story isn't preached on very much in church. Have you ever had a pastor, go on and on about this sermon? But if it is taught, the part that's skipped over by omission, lied by omission, is that God Himself got a portion of the plunder, including 88 animals and 32 virgins. So these portion of the virgins and of the animals that were captured were taken to the temple and they were delivered to God. Now, some people will say, well, they just were maidens in the temple. They certainly weren't slaughtered. But that is not in any way, shape, or form what the Bible indicates. Things that were given to God were burnt offerings. There's nowhere to suggest that these virgins lived or that the animals lived. They were probably, most likely, slaughtered and given to God. Now, keep in mind that virgins in this day and age were very young because most girls were married at 12, 13, maybe 14. By 15, you would have been an old maid. So these were children. These could have been 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, maybe as old as 12 as 13, but that's it. These are not grown women that are virgins. These are children. So that kind of goes back to the child sacrifice thing, doesn't it? These were sacrificed to God. So that's disgusting. It's one of the most disturbing passages in the Bible, and I would like to know what you guys think about that. I don't know if you guys heard of this when you were a Christian. I certainly didn't. And if you're a Christian, again, go ask your pastor about this and see what they have to say. Bet you they'll say that they became temple slaves. They probably didn't. Okay, let's get to the last thing that I didn't know when I was a Christian. And maybe you did. Maybe you're smarter than I am. But let's go to the book of Judges and let's talk about a Hebrew general. And I will probably butcher his name, but it is Jephthah. I guess that's how you pronounce it. He was a very powerful Hebrew general, like I said. And he was maybe apparently losing in battle or didn't feel very confident. So he made a little, not a bet, I guess you could say he made a little agreement with God that if he would win, the first thing that walked out of his door, he would sacrifice to God. And maybe he thought his dog would walk out or a rooster would walk out of his house or something like that. But unfortunately for him, he did win the battle. And when he came home, his only daughter and his favorite child came out and she was dancing and singing and so happy to see her father. And he tore his clothes and he was so upset because he knew that now he had to sacrifice this child. And of course, she would have been a child because it says later on in the text that she grieved for her virginity. Again, meaning she could have been 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We don't know, but she certainly was no older than a early teen because she would have been married and living with her husband. So God, right, all powerful, all knowing, he couldn't have made a chicken walk out the door or a cat or a dog or whatever pet he had, which is awful enough. It's gross that God wanted a blood sacrifice of any kind, but the man's favorite daughter, his only daughter, how disturbing and disgusting can you be? Because God could have made anything come out of that door. So this is a sacrifice that God obviously wanted. Now you'll see Christian apologists say, well, God was teaching this guy a lesson. He was teaching this general a lesson, not to make these deals with God. Really? That's the only way that God could teach this guy a lesson? He couldn't have said, no, I don't make these kind of deals, right? God spoke to people back then. He couldn't have said, no, absolutely not. You're on your own. I don't make these kind of deals. No, let's sacrifice a young girl. Now, again, Christian apologists will also say, oh, well, she was delivered to the temple, and the sacrifice was that she was just to be in the temple. And that is just patently untrue. Nowhere does it indicate that. The Hebrew general said, I will sacrifice my daughter. And back then, sacrifice meant normally a burnt offering or a slaying to God. It doesn't indicate that. And it does say that she went into the mountains, the young girl did, to grieve her virginity, and that, then she was sacrificed. So that, there's nothing that you can say to make that better. Even best case, even if it was the best case that she was given to the temple as a slave, how awful and disturbing is that? That a young girl was made a slave, and that's what God wanted for her. It's little better than being killed. I guess maybe she would be able to escape someday or something. But anyway, it's all disgusting. It's all disturbing. This is not a story I ever heard. And if you heard it, if your pastor preached on that, I'd like to know, because I never heard that. 50 years in the church, never heard it. So thank you so much. I hope this video does well so I can keep on. If not, I will wait longer. I will not make any more videos for a while until this whole Trump thing has died down. All right, thanks, and I will see you next time.